At this exact moment, 340 million European accounts are being permanently erased from the most powerful social media platform on Earth. Not suspended, not restricted, not placed under review, erased. Gone. With no mechanism for recovery and no legal pathway to reversal. And the man responsible for pressing that button, the wealthiest individual in recorded human history, did not do it because he lost a legal battle. He did not do it because he ran out of options. He did it because he chose to. Because when the European Union, the most formidable regulatory institution on the planet, the body that had forced Apple and Google and Meta into submission, came to Elon Musk with its demands and its fines and its ultimatums, he looked at everything Brussels had built and said two words that no billionaire had ever said to European regulators before in the institution's entire history. I quit. Not, I will negotiate better terms. Not, I will appeal through the courts. Not, I will pay whatever fine is necessary and restructure accordingly. He quit. He pulled the platform from an entire continent. He walked away from $4.7 billion in annual revenue. And he did it in a single morning, before the European Commission had finished its first coffee of the day. Before Brussels had time to activate a single legal mechanism, before anyone inside the Berlaymont building fully understood what was happening until it was already completely irreversible. And the woman who had spent 22 months designing the regulatory trap that was supposed to bring Musk permanently to heel, who had watched Apple restructure its entire ecosystem on her instruction, who had watched Google pay billions and rebuild its systems to her specification, who had watched Meta dismantle and reconstruct its entire European data infrastructure because Brussels told it to. That woman was sitting in her office watching her life's most important institutional achievement dissolve in real time, with no legal tool available fast enough to stop it. This is the complete story of how Europe lost its war against Elon Musk, and why the consequences of that loss extend far beyond one social media platform and one regulatory fine. To understand what happened on the morning of January 2nd, 2026, you have to go back 22 months earlier to a glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of the Berlaymont building in Brussels, where the European Commission's most senior leadership gathered for a meeting that was treated, at the time, as entirely routine. The subject of the meeting was a problem that had been growing steadily since October 2022, when Musk completed his $44 billion acquisition of Twitter, and immediately began doing things that European regulators had never encountered from the owner of a major technology platform. In his very first week of ownership, Musk eliminated 3/4 of Twitter's content moderation workforce. He restored accounts that European authorities had spent years pressuring the previous management to permanently ban. He publicly described the European Union's Digital Services Act, the centerpiece of Brussels' entire digital governance strategy, as a tool of censorship dressed in the language of consumer protection. He allowed categories of content that EU analysts had classified as coordinated disinformation to spread across the platform without the restrictions that Brussels considered legally mandatory. And 340 million European users engaged with that content every single day, sharing it, amplifying it, organizing around it, building political movements that the European Commission believed were systematically weakening democratic institutions across the continent. For the Commission's leadership, this situation had a simple diagnosis. Musk was a problem that required a permanent solution. Not management, not monitoring, a solution. And the Commission's leadership believed, with complete and well-founded confidence, that it possessed exactly the tools necessary to deliver one. Because the European Union's track record with American technology companies was not a record of failure. It was a record of absolute dominance. Apple had restructured its entire App Store ecosystem, a system generating tens of billions in annual revenue, because Brussels threatened penalties large enough to make resistance economically irrational. Google had paid more than 8 billion euros across multiple antitrust cases and had fundamentally redesigned how its search and advertising products operated across European markets. Meta had dismantled its European data collection infrastructure entirely and rebuilt it from scratch, according to specifications that EU regulators had approved line by line. The pattern was consistent across every confrontation. The American company would resist publicly, making aggressive statements about regulatory overreach and free market principles. Then, the company's financial calculations would overtake its ideological positions. The European market represented too much revenue, too many consumers with too much purchasing power to sacrifice on the altar of principle.
Every CEO eventually reached the same conclusion. Compliance was cheaper than resistance, and signing Brussels' agreement was preferable to losing Brussels' market. The Commission had every rational reason to expect Musk to follow the identical path. He had built a $44 billion company. Men who build $44 billion companies do not throw away revenue out of ideology when the financial pressure reaches a sufficient threshold. That was the foundational assumption that drove every decision Brussels made over the following 22 months. And it was the assumption that was about to produce the most catastrophic strategic miscalculation in the European Commission's regulatory history.
The legal case that Brussels assembled against X was the most comprehensive the Commission had ever constructed against a single technology company. Over 22 months, a team of EU investigators documented 847 specific violations of the Digital Services Act. They collected sworn testimony from more than 300 independent researchers who documented that X had systematically denied them access to platform data that European law explicitly required Musk to provide. They compiled thousands of examples of content that EU analysts classified as coordinated manipulation, specifically designed to distort elections, undermine public health communications, and erode confidence in European democratic processes. The final legal file exceeded 2,400 pages. Every allegation had been verified through multiple independent sources. Every legal argument had been pressure tested against the strongest available counterarguments. Every potential procedural challenge had been identified and answered in advance. This was not a political statement assembled quickly to generate headlines. This was a precision legal instrument built over nearly 2 years, with one specific operational purpose: to give Brussels the enforceable authority to reach inside X's San Francisco headquarters and take direct control of what 340 million Europeans could see, read, and say on the platform every day. The enforcement structure was built in 3 escalating phases, each designed to make resistance progressively more financially unsustainable. The first phase was immediate: a €20 million fine targeting what Brussels classified as deceptive consumer practices related to X's verification system, which EU regulators argued had systematically misled European users about the credibility and authenticity of accounts carrying the blue checkmark. The second phase was structural: formal charges establishing that X had functioned as what the Commission's official documents described as a systemic amplifier of content harmful to European democratic processes, with additional financial penalties capable of reaching 6% of X's entire global annual revenue if Musk refused to implement the content governance reforms Brussels was demanding. The third phase was the mechanism that the Commission's leadership considered its decisive weapon: the guarantee that would make the entire enforcement architecture undefeatable. Unless Musk agreed to install European Union-approved content moderators directly inside X's headquarters, officials carrying not advisory authority, but actual legal enforcement power to remove content, suspend accounts, and override the platform's own editorial decisions, X would be simultaneously banned from every app store across all 27 EU member states. No European iPhone user could download it. No European Android user could access it. The platform would functionally cease to exist for 340 million people unless Musk surrendered direct editorial control to officials appointed by European bureaucrats. The Commission's leadership presented this plan in January 2025 with the kind of confidence that comes from an unbroken record of success. The Musk compliance timeline was walked through with the same framework that had guided the Apple timeline and the Google timeline and the Meta timeline.
First, Musk would respond with explosive public statements about censorship and authoritarianism, generating enormous international media coverage that would make him appear erratic and ideologically unstable to European investors and business partners. Second, his legal team would quietly request preliminary meetings with EU officials to begin exploring what a negotiated settlement framework might look like. Third, months of technical negotiation would follow, with Musk's lawyers haggling over the precise boundaries of EU moderator authority and the exact structure of the financial penalties. Fourth, Musk would announce publicly that he had successfully defended free speech by extracting meaningful concessions from Brussels, while privately agreeing to substantially everything the EU had originally demanded. The Commission had modeled this scenario repeatedly. Every simulation arrived at the same endpoint. The money would win. The revenue was too substantial. The market was too valuable. The economic logic was too overwhelming for any rational business decision-maker to resist. What the Commission's modeling consistently failed to capture was a distinction that should have been obvious if anyone in Brussels had examined the structural differences between Musk and every previous CEO they had successfully pressured. Tim Cook managed Apple on behalf of institutional shareholders who held him accountable to financial return metrics above all other considerations. Sundar Pichai operated Google within a governance structure where board members and major investors retained meaningful authority over decisions that destroyed significant shareholder value. Mark Zuckerberg, despite controlling Meta's voting shares, operated within a publicly traded company ecosystem where the sustained destruction of market capitalization created real institutional pressure toward economically rational decisions. Musk owned X completely and privately. There was no board with override authority. There were no institutional shareholders with legal standing to challenge decisions that cost billions. There were no financial partners whose terms required him to prioritize revenue preservation over personal conviction. There was exactly one person whose judgment about X's future mattered, and that person had spent the previous 2 years making absolutely clear, in public statements that Brussels had consistently dismissed as performance, that he considered the EU's content governance demands to be a fundamental attack on the principle of free expression that he was not willing to accommodate, regardless of the financial consequences. Brussels had the entire text of that position available to read. They had chosen to interpret it as negotiating theater. It was not negotiating theater. It was an accurate description of what was about to happen. While the Commission's legal team was finalizing the documents they expected would compel Musk's eventual surrender, Musk was 7 months into planning an operation that Brussels had not included in a single strategic scenario. He was not preparing a legal defense. He was not preparing a negotiating strategy. He was preparing a complete and permanent exit, executed with the operational precision of someone who had built rockets and electric vehicles and global satellite networks, and understood, at a level of technical and logistical detail that Brussels entirely lacked, exactly what it took to make a decision of this scale irreversible before anyone with the authority to intervene could mobilize a response. On December 8, 2025, 3 specialized operational teams inside X were formally activated. The first was an engineering group responsible for designing and testing the technical deletion architecture, a 14-phase sequential process for permanently removing every European account from X's active database infrastructure. The second was a financial operations group responsible for unwinding nearly 5,000 individual advertising contracts with European companies, calculating exact settlements to the cent, and processing refunds in real time during the execution window. The third was a narrative strategy team, which Musk personally considered the most strategically critical component of the entire operation, responsible for ensuring that when the announcement went public, the global conversation was immediately framed around the question Musk wanted the world to be asking, rather than the question Brussels wanted the world to be asking. At 5:13 in the morning Brussels time on January 2, 2026, 47 minutes before Musk's public announcement, the first engineering phase activated. The 47-minute head start was not accidental. Musk's team had calculated that the deletion process would require approximately 72 hours to complete, and they needed the irreversible technical work to be already underway before the public statement created any window for political or legal intervention. Every account associated with a European IP address, every account registered with a European phone number, every account linked to a European payment method was systematically isolated from the global platform architecture, archived in encrypted form, and permanently removed from X's active systems. 340 million accounts, representing years of posts, conversations, communities, and connections, were being erased with a completeness that left nothing recoverable.
At 6 in the morning, Musk's post went live. The European Commission's crisis response began 4 minutes later, when the Commission President's Chief of Staff reached her on her personal mobile. She was already awake. She had already read the post multiple times, searching for the diplomatic signal, the hidden negotiating invitation, the implicit opening that every other CEO had buried inside their angry public statements. There was nothing there. No signal. No opening. No door left ajar. The termination was already executing while she was reading about it. And unlike every previous confrontation the Commission had managed, this one had been specifically engineered to be past the point of legal intervention before Brussels could mobilize. The emergency meeting of the College of Commissioners, convened at 8:30 in the morning, produced something that veteran Brussels observers described as unprecedented in the Commission's institutional history. Rather than unified crisis response, it produced open disagreement among commissioners in the middle of an active emergency. The French commissioner argued for immediate court injunctions to freeze the deletion process through emergency provisions of the Digital Services Act. The German commissioner, representing a government that had grown increasingly skeptical of the Commission's confrontational approach toward American technology platforms, argued that the original strategic calculation had been fundamentally wrong, and that legal attempts to force Musk's return would generate a public relations outcome more damaging than the exit itself. The Italian commissioner, whose government had been publicly sympathetic to Musk's criticisms of EU content regulation for months, communicated her position through a silence that required no interpretation. Outside the meeting room, the fracture lines that Musk's strategy had been specifically designed to create were already widening. Hungary issued an immediate statement praising the decision and calling on Brussels to abandon what it described as its campaign of regulatory aggression against American technology companies. Italy's government stopped just short of open praise, but issued commentary about proportionate regulation that read unmistakably as distance from the Commission's strategy. Across multiple member state governments that officially supported the Commission's position, individual politicians were rushing to separate themselves from the specific demand for EU-appointed content moderators inside X's headquarters, the demand that was generating the sharpest public reaction. The demand that even citizens broadly supportive of digital regulation found difficult to defend when it was described accurately and directly. Musk had not invented the authoritarian framing that was dominating global conversation. Brussels had written the policy that made the framing factually accurate, and Musk had simply ensured the entire world read it simultaneously before the Commission had time to construct a counter-narrative. The EU had genuinely demanded enforcement officials inside a private company's headquarters with the authority to override editorial decisions. That was real. And in the court of global public opinion, a court operating at a speed that Brussels' legal machinery could not match, the verdict on that demand was being delivered in real time. But none of the collapsing political unity, none of the deteriorating public perception, none of the $2.3 billion in advertising contracts being unwound in real time was the development that finally converted Brussels' crisis into something resembling genuine institutional panic. That came 31 hours after the announcement, when a single automated signal traveled from X's Starlink Operations Center in Redmond, Washington, to 847 ground stations positioned across the European continent. And in hospitals processing emergency patient data, in military installations coordinating logistics across member state borders, in remote agricultural operations tracking weather and soil systems, in emergency response centers monitoring infrastructure across the continent. Screens that had been glowing went dark. And the people responsible for keeping those systems operational reached for their phones to call for help, and discovered that the problem was not local, was not fixable, and was not something the European Commission had included in a single one of its 22 months of strategic planning. Because when you spend 2 years building a trap for a man who owns the infrastructure, you have not built a trap. You have handed him the most powerful negotiating instrument you could possibly have given him. And he had just used it. And Brussels was only beginning to understand what that actually meant. Subscribe right now because the next video covers what happened in the 72 hours that followed, what the Starlink shutdown actually affected, how European governments responded when the infrastructure panic reached its peak, and whether the Commission found any mechanism to reverse what Musk had set in motion. This story is not finished. It has barely started.